Silver Creek was the kind of town where dust settled into the cracks of boots and never truly left. Wooden buildings leaned slightly from years of wind, and the church bell rang more often for funerals than for weddings. Thomas Hale knew that better than anyone. His workshop stood at the edge of town, a quiet place filled with the scent of pine and cedar. By trade, he was a carpenter. By reputation, he was the man who built coffins for free. The first coffin he ever made without charge had been for his own wife. Mary had fallen ill during a harsh winter 3 years before. Fever took her quickly, leaving Thomas in a house that echoed with absence. When the undertaker demanded payment Thomas could not afford, shame burned through him hotter than grief. He sold half his tools to give her a proper burial. After that, he made a promise. No one in Silver Creek would ever struggle to bury their loved one again. So, when the old miner passed with no family to claim him, Thomas built the coffin himself. When a ranch hand was thrown from a horse and left behind a widow and 2 small boys, Thomas worked through the night without asking a single coin. Word spread. Some called him noble. Others called him foolish. Thomas called it necessary. One late afternoon, as the sun stretched gold across the plains, the bell above his workshop door chimed. He wiped sawdust from his hands and looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, her posture straight despite the long road behind her. She carried a leather satchel and wore the modest dress of a nurse. Strands of brown hair escaped her bonnet, brushing against determined eyes. "Mr. Hale?" she asked gently. "That's me. My name is Agatha Whitmore. I've taken the nursing post at the clinic." Thomas nodded politely. "Silver Creek will be grateful." She stepped inside, studying the half-finished coffin resting on his bench. Her expression didn't flinch. She had seen death before. "I've heard about what you do," she said softly. "Building for families who can't pay." He shrugged. "It's just wood." "No," she replied. "It's dignity." Her words struck something inside him. Few people understood the difference. Agatha ran her fingers along the smooth edge of the coffin. "I lost my father to influenza. We nearly couldn't afford his burial. I know what that kind of fear feels like." Thomas met her eyes for the first time fully. There was strength there, but also sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She gave a small smile. "I've learned that tending the sick is only half the work. The other half is tending the living after." Outside, a wagon rattled past. Life moved forward, indifferent as ever. "If I send families your way," Agatha continued, "I'd like to help somehow. Meals, supplies, company." Thomas had grown used to solitude. Grief had become his companion. The idea of someone sharing that space unsettled him. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to." Agatha Whitmore did not fear sorrow. She had seen it in hospital tents, in dim bedrooms where mothers clutched rosaries, in the eyes of fathers pretending to be strong. Silver Creek was smaller than the towns she had worked in before, but pain did not measure itself by population. It arrived just the same. Within weeks of her arrival, the clinic was rarely quiet. Ranch hands came in with broken ribs and shattered fingers. Children arrived with fevers. Miners coughed black dust into white cloth. And when someone did not recover, Agatha walked the grieving family to the edge of town. To Thomas, the first time she did so, it was for Mrs. Keegan, whose husband had succumbed to a lung infection. The widow clutched her shawl tightly. Shame etched deep into her face. "We don't have much," Mrs. Keegan whispered. Thomas simply nodded. "You don't need much," he measured, carefully, speaking gently. Asking about Mr. Keegan's height and broad shoulders, as though building a suit rather than a coffin. Agatha watched the exchange closely. There was no pity in Thomas's tone, only respect. Later that evening, she returned with a basket of stew and bread. The workshop glowed with lamplight, and Thomas was sanding the lid with slow, deliberate strokes. "You'll wear your hands down to bone at this rate," she said softly. "They've weathered worse," he replied. She set the basket down and studied him. His sleeves were rolled, revealing strong forearms lined with small scars. His face carried the weight of years. though he was not yet old. "You don't speak much," she observed. "Talking doesn't change what's happened." "No," she agreed. "But it changes what happens next." Thomas paused. Agatha stepped closer, her voice lowering. "You don't build these coffins out of obligation. You build them because you know what it means to stand alone." The truth of it hung between them. "My wife," he said finally. "Mary, fever took her." Agatha's expression softened, but did not falter. "I'm sorry." He shrugged slightly. "Sorry doesn't bring her back." "No," Agatha said gently. "But it means someone sees your pain." He hadn't thought of it that way. Outside, night settled over Silver Creek. The wind hummed against the wooden walls. Inside, something quieter unfolded. Agatha unpacked the food without asking permission. She handed him a bowl. "Eat." He hesitated. "You don't have to look after me." "I'm not," she said. "I'm sharing a meal." They sat across from one another on overturned crates, steam rising between them. For a moment, there were no coffins, no loss, just warm bread and the simple comfort of presence. "Do you ever grow tired?" she asked, after a while. "Of building, of carrying other people's sorrow?" Thomas considered the question. "It feels lighter than carrying my own." Agatha leaned back slightly. "Perhaps it wouldn't be so heavy if you let someone share it." He met her gaze, steady and searching. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but uncertain. Finally, Thomas nodded once. "Then I won't refuse." Agatha smiled, and something shifted in the workshop. The air felt lighter, as if a window had been opened. As she stepped back into the fading light, Thomas returned to his bench. But for the first time in years, the sound of his hammer didn't echo quite so hollow. He was still a man shaped by loss, but perhaps, just perhaps, he would not carry it alone anymore. Agatha Whitmore did not fear sorrow. She had seen it in hospital tents, in dim bedrooms where mothers clutched rosaries, in the eyes of fathers pretending to be strong. Silver Creek was smaller than the towns she had worked in before, but pain did not measure itself by population. It arrived just the same. Within weeks of her arrival, the clinic was rarely quiet. Ranch hands came in with broken ribs and shattered fingers. Children arrived with fevers. Miners coughed black dust into white cloth. And when someone did not recover, Agatha walked the grieving family to the edge of town. Thomas, the first time she did so, it was for Mrs. Keegan, whose husband had succumbed to a lung infection. The widow clutched her shawl tightly. Shame etched deep into her face. "We don't have much," Mrs. Keegan whispered. Thomas simply nodded. "You don't need much." He measured carefully, speaking gently, asking about Mr. Keegan's height and broad shoulders, as though building a suit rather than a coffin. Agatha watched the exchange closely. There was no pity in Thomas's tone, only respect. Later that evening, she returned with a basket of stew and bread. The workshop glowed with lamplight, and Thomas was sanding the lid with slow, deliberate strokes. "You'll wear your hands down to bone at this rate," she said softly. "They've weathered worse," he replied. She set the basket down and studied him. His sleeves were rolled, revealing strong forearms lined with small scars. His face carried the weight of years, though he was not yet old. "You don't speak much," she observed. "Talking doesn't change what's happened." "No," she agreed. "But it changes what happens next." Thomas paused. Agatha stepped closer, her voice lowering. "You don't build these coffins out of obligation. You build them because you know what it means to stand alone." The truth of it hung between them. "My wife," he said finally. "Mary, fever took her." Agatha's expression softened, but did not falter. "I'm sorry." He shrugged slightly. "Sorry doesn't bring her back." "No," Agatha said gently. "But it means someone sees your pain." He hadn't thought of it that way. Outside, night settled over Silver Creek. The wind hummed against the wooden walls. Inside, something quieter unfolded. Agatha unpacked the food without asking permission. She handed him a bowl. "Eat." He hesitated. "You don't have to look after me." "I'm not," she said. "I'm sharing a meal." They sat across from one another on overturned crates, steam rising between them. For a moment, There were no coffins, no loss. Just warm bread and the simple comfort of presence. "Do you ever grow tired?" she asked after a while. "Of building, of carrying other people's sorrow." Thomas considered the question. "It feels lighter than carrying my own." Agatha leaned back slightly. "Perhaps it wouldn't be so heavy if you let someone share it." He met her gaze, steady and searching. "You're stubborn," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "So, I've been told." A small laugh escaped him before he could stop it. It surprised them both. The sound lingered in the Arak word at first, then warm. Days turned into weeks. Agatha's visits became more frequent. Sometimes she came with news of recovery. Sometimes with word of loss. Sometimes with nothing but quiet companionship. She mended a torn curtain in his workshop one afternoon without being asked. Another day, she placed wildflowers in a jar by the window. "You can't fill every space with wood," she told him. "And you can't fix everything with flowers," he replied. "No," she agreed softly. "But we can try." The town began to notice the change. Thomas stood straighter. His silences were no longer heavy, but thoughtful. Agatha's laughter echoed more often near the edge of town. They were still surrounded by sorrow. But now, grief met mercy. And mercy, Thomas was beginning to learn, had a way of reshaping even the hardest wood. Winter returned early that year. The first frost clung to the edges of Silver Creek like a warning. Cattle grew restless. Children coughed through the night. And before long, a fever began creeping from house to house. Agatha barely slept. The clinic lantern burned long past midnight as she moved from bedside to bedside, cooling foreheads and whispering steady reassurances. She wrote careful notes in a small leather journal, tracking temperatures, symptoms, prayers. Thomas noticed the change immediately. Her visits to the workshop grew shorter. The flowers she once brought were replaced by hurried footsteps and tired smiles. "You need rest," he told her one evening, when she stopped by to request another coffin. "For the Jenkins boy," she said quietly. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. "He's only 9, I know." He didn't ask questions. He simply began measuring. Agatha stood near the doorway, her shoulders tense. "I tried everything." "I know you did." Her voice trembled for the first time since she'd arrived in Silver Creek. "It should not be children." Thomas set down his tools and faced her. "It should not be anyone." Silence thickened between them. Agatha pressed her hands together, steadying herself. "Sometimes I think if I were better if I worked harder." "You cannot fight death with willpower alone," Thomas interrupted gently. Her eyes flashed. "Then what good am I?" He stepped closer, careful, deliberate. "You sit beside the dying so they're not afraid. You hold their mothers when the breath leaves them. You make sure they are not alone. That doesn't save them." "No," he said softly. "But it saves something." She looked at him, confusion mixing with grief. "It saves their dignity," he continued. "The same way I try to." The truth of it settled heavily. That night, Thomas worked through the dark hours, crafting the smallest coffin he had built in years. His hands did not shake, though his heart did. When morning came, Agatha returned with hollow eyes. "It's done," he said quietly. She ran her fingers over the smooth lid, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You make them beautiful. They deserve that much." She nodded. As they carried the coffin together toward the church, snow began to fall, silent, relentless. The fever worsened over the next week. 3 more passed. Thomas's workshop filled again with the familiar rhythm of grief. But something else filled it to Agatha's presence. She began staying after dark, sitting near the stove while he sanded or polished. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. One night, after another loss, she sank into a chair and covered her face. "I failed her," she whispered. Thomas knelt before her, gently pulling her hands away. "You stayed. That's not the same." "It is," he said firmly. "You think healing only means stopping death. It doesn't. Sometimes it means standing in the storm, so others don't face it alone." Her breathing steadied slowly. "You speak as if you know," she said. "I do," he admitted. "When Mary died, what hurt most wasn't that she left, it was the quiet after. The emptiness, Agatha's voice softened. Now, the quiet isn't so empty. She looked at him, truly looked at him. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls. Inside, warmth gathered between them, not from the stove, but from shared understanding. Thomas, she said hesitantly, what if the fever takes more? What if it takes you? He smiled faintly. Then you'll make sure I'm not alone. Her lips trembled despite herself. Don't joke. I'm not. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood there in the workshop, surrounded by unfinished wood and the scent of pine. Holding on, not out of desperation, but out of choice. The fever eventually began to loosen its grip. Fewer lanterns burned through the night. Fewer bells tolled at the church. Silver Creek exhaled, but the losses had marked them both. One evening, as the snow melted into soft mud and the first hints of spring touched the horizon, Agatha stood beside Thomas outside the workshop. I cannot save everyone, she said quietly. No, he agreed. She looked at him steadily. But I don't have to carry it alone. He squeezed her hand gently. No, he said, you don't. And in that simple truth, something stronger than sorrow took root. Not because death had vanished, but because love had chosen to stay. Spring arrived slowly, as if uncertain it was welcome. The snow melted into streams that ran along the edges of Silver Creek's dirt roads. Wildflowers pushed through stubborn soil. The church bell rang less often, and for the first time in months, the clinic windows stood open to fresh air. The fever had passed. Thomas stood outside his workshop one morning, sunlight warming his shoulders. It felt unfamiliar, working without urgency, pressing against his ribs. For weeks, he had built only coffins. Now, a different order sat on his bench. The cradle. He ran his hand along the curved wood, careful and precise. The request had come from the Miller family, who were expecting their first child. It had been years since he'd built something meant to hold new life. He wasn't sure why his hands trembled. You're measuring that twice more than necessary. Agatha's voice carried a hint of amusement as she approached. She looked rested for the first time since winter. There was still sadness in her eyes, but it no longer ruled her. Old habits, Thomas replied quietly. She stepped inside the workshop and studied the cradle frame. It's beautiful. I haven't finished. You never think you have. He gave a small smile. Perfection matters. Agatha tilted her head. Or perhaps you're afraid of building something hopeful. The words struck closer than he expected. Thomas leaned against the workbench. I built coffins because I understood them. There's no uncertainty in death. It's final, and life isn't. No, he admitted. Life is fragile. Agatha walked closer, resting her hand lightly on the cradle. So is grief, and yet, we survived it. He looked at her carefully. You're braver than I am. She shook her head. No, I simply decided that fear would not make my choices. Silence stretched between them, not heavy, but meaningful. Thomas, she continued softly, when I first came to Silver Creek, I saw a man who had buried himself with his wife. You were alive, but you were not living. He didn't deny it. And now, he asked. Now, I see a man who still honors the dead but is no longer afraid of the living. Her gaze held his steadily. He swallowed. Agatha, he said slowly, I don't know how to begin again. You already have, she answered. Outside, the wind stirred gently through the tall grass. The town felt different, lighter, almost expectant. Thomas reached for the cradle frame again. When Mary died, I thought loving someone again would betray her. Agatha's expression softened. Love is not betrayal. It's expansion. He looked at her, searching for doubt. He found none. But if I fail, he asked quietly. You will, she said honestly. So will I. He blinked, surprised. But we will not fail alone, she added. The simplicity of it steadied him more than any grand promise could have. Later that evening, as the sun painted the horizon in gold and crimson, Thomas finished the cradle. He ran a final cloth along its surface, smoothing the last imperfection. Agatha stood beside him, watching. It's ready, he said. For the Millers, she asked. For whatever comes next. She smiled. He set the cloth aside and turned fully toward her. His heart pounded harder than it had the day he buried Mary. "I don't want to build alone anymore," he said. Agatha's breath caught. "I still build coffins," he continued, voice steady. "And I always will, for those who need them. But I would like to build a life, her eyes shimmered in the fading light. "With me?" she asked softly. "With you." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, Agatha stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart. The word was simple, certain. Thomas exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of held breath. He pulled her gently into his arms, and this time he did not feel guilt. He felt peace. In the distance, children's laughter echoed through town. The scent of spring hung in the air. The future, uncertain as ever, no longer felt frightening. It felt possible. And as Thomas stood in the doorway of his workshop with Agatha beside him, he understood something he had not allowed himself to believe before. He had spent years building 4 endings. Now, he was ready to build for beginnings. The wedding took place beneath an open sky. Silver Creek gathered near the edge of town, where the land stretched wide and golden. There were no grand decorations, no polished floors, just wooden benches, wildflowers gathered by children, and a simple arch Thomas had built himself. He sanded it 3 times before declaring it finished. Agatha wore a modest white dress, stitched carefully by Mrs. Keegan, whose husband Thomas had once buried without charge. The fabric was plain, but she carried it with quiet grace. Thomas stood waiting in his cleanest shirt and polished boots, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. When Agatha walked toward him, sunlight caught in her hair. For a brief moment, he thought of Mary, not with guilt, not with ache, but with gratitude. Mary had been part of his story. Agatha was part of what came next. The pastor spoke gently of commitment, of choosing one another through hardship and joy. The town listened closely. They had watched these 2 people carry sorrow for others. They understood what this union meant. When Thomas said, "I do," his voice did not waver. When Agatha answered the same, there was strength in it. Silver Creek applauded, as though celebrating something larger than a marriage. Because they were witnessing hope take root. Life after the wedding did not suddenly become easy. Loss did not vanish from town. Illness still came. Accidents still happened. And Thomas still built coffins for free. But now, the workshop held more than grief. Agatha often sat near the window, sorting bandages or mending torn sleeves, while Thomas worked. Families who came seeking help were greeted not by a solitary man, but by 2 steady hearts. Agatha organized meal trains for widows. Thomas quietly repaired broken fences for those who had lost their strength. They never called it charity. They called it neighborly. One evening, months after their wedding, a young couple arrived in tears. Their baby had been stillborn. The father stood stiff with shock. The mother could barely breathe through her grief. Thomas felt the old weight return. But this time Agatha stood beside him. He built the smallest coffin he had ever made, sanding it until it felt as smooth as silk. Agatha wrapped the baby in soft linen and whispered a prayer over the tiny form. They walked the couple to the church together. Afterward, as dusk settled over the plains, Thomas sat heavily on the workshop steps. Agatha joined him. "Some days will always hurt," she said quietly. "Yes," he agreed, "but we are not alone in them." He looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had stepped into his sorrow without flinching, who had reminded him that tending the living mattered just as much as honoring the dead. "I used to think this workshop was a place of endings," he said. Now, it's a place of mercy." Agatha rested her head against his shoulder. Years passed. Gently, laughter filled their home more often than silence. A cradle Thomas once feared to build now rocked near the fireplace, holding their own child-proof that love could grow even in soil once hardened by grief. Thomas still measured boards carefully. He still refused payment from those who had none. But when he closed the workshop doors at night, he stepped into a house warm with light. He no longer built from sorrow alone. He built from love. And Silver Creek, once known for hardship, became known for something else entirely: a carpenter who gave dignity to the grieving, and a nurse who healed more than wounds. Together, they proved that even in the wild heart of the West, compassion could be stronger than loss. As the sun dipped low, one quiet evening, Thomas wrapped his arm around Agatha and watched their child chase fireflies in the fading light. "I thought my life ended once," he said softly. Agatha smiled. "It was only being rebuilt." He nodded. "Not every man is remembered for wealth. Not every life is marked by grand achievements. But some are remembered for kindness." And that, Thomas realized, was enough. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Western stories.